Welcome, Gothamites, to another episode of the Arkham Sessions. My name is Brian Ward. With me, as always, the psychologist to the superheroes, superheroines, and supervillains of Gotham City. She's Dr. Drea Letamendi. Dr. Drea.
Hello.
Welcome.
Hi.
You're going to be doing a lot of heavy lifting on this very special episode. It's a surprise episode.
It is.
By surprise, I mean those of you listening in your cars or at home or at work or on the treadmill, wherever you listen to your podcasts, you thought you were going to be getting episode 3 of Harley Quinn, but instead you're getting an entirely different Harley. If you've looked at the title of this episode, you know that we are covering the sequel to the Academy Award-winning Joker. We are covering Joker Folie Deux.
Thank you for pronouncing the title of that movie. I do want to say something. Mm-hmm. A couple things. I went to the dentist today.
Okay.
It's been several hours, but I'm still noticing a little bit of a slur. So I I apologize. I'm going to do my best to enunciate well. The other thing is, for those of you who have video, I'm giving, actually it's more Alice Cooper than it is Harley Quinn.
Yeah.
So
yeah, there's something happening.
For those of you who don't know, Alice Cooper is an elderly
and
roll.
Some
people might not know.
I mean,
Alice Cooper
Let's be clear, though. In your description of Alice Cooper, the first adjective you used was elderly?
You didn't let me finish.
Okay.
An elderly, like an elder rock and roll genius. That's where I was going with that.
I see. I mean, some people would just say rock legend,
yes,
icon.
Yes, those are all good too.
Elderly first. He was predominantly famous in the 70s, in the 80s.
Sure.
Anyone who knows Wayne's World would know the famous Alice Cooper scene where they go. And by the way, I've worked with Alice Cooper.
He's known to be a kind-hearted
super
soul.
Nice guy.
I actually hope to meet him one day. But anyway, I was kind of going for the subtle Harley Quinn from this film, mm-hmm. and I'm realizing how Alice Cooper-ish it actually looks. So yeah,
I am a little terrified.
No, it's all good. But
and by the way, we should note that for this very special episode, we have decided to make this video live for all listeners, not just on Patreon, but this will be going up on YouTube as well because we're covering something so timely, and because you look like an elderly rock icon.
So we're going to jump right into our review of the Joker 2 movie. I just have a couple things to say. One is this will include spoilers.
Lots of spoilers. That's what we do.
We do it all the time, but for folks who are new to us,
if you've not seen it and you're interested in seeing it before hearing our analysis of it, you should probably see the movie first.
And that leads me to my second point, which is this film. This is more of a disclaimer if you are unsure whether you want to watch the film before listening to the show. This movie includes depictions of situations that are very, very violent. So mm-hmm. gun violence, intimate partner violence, mm-hmm. suicide.
And yet not nearly as violent as the first movie.
Perhaps.
Surprisingly.
Yeah, sure. Let me go on. Mass casualty events mm-hmm. and police brutality. Mm-hmm. So while to the degree that it may not have shown as much violence as the first film, there's flashbacks to the first film that are quite disturbing and ghastly. Mm-hmm. And this film has what I would call, as someone sensitive to violence, like sudden acts of interpersonal violence that you maybe you're ready for, but like kind of it's unsettling, disturbing, and it moves between fantasy and reality mm-hmm. in a way that is psychologically unsettling because you don't know what's real and what's not. And so anything goes kind of a situation. There's an uncertainty and a really unsettling unexpectedness around what takes place.
Unless you're watching in IMAX, which we did, and you notice the aspect ratio change.
Oh, there
Most
you
of
go.
the fantasy sequences used up the entire IMAX format. Everything else grounded was sort of in a wider screen.
I did not notice that.
Yeah. That's what I know. I noticed.
I
noticed when things like aspect ratios
It's
change.
cool. Like, I love that you noticed that, because I didn't. As a psychologist, I was expecting actions and behaviors and looking at cues and antecedents for when those things would happen. So I did anticipate certain things, which we'll get into.
Before we get into any spoiler material, in the broadest strokes possible, because you and I saw this last night, and afterward we did not discuss it. We specifically wanted to wait until this conversation.
Yeah.
You do not know what I thought of the movie. I do not know what you thought of the movie. Only that we both saw the same screening. In the broadest strokes possible, meaning do not get into detail. We'll get into that in a moment. Did you like the movie? Did you not like the movie? Or were you, impartial, leaning neither way? And why?
I liked the movie, but I did not think it was a great movie.
Okay.
I'm not sure that it's even a good movie.
Okay.
But I did like it because it gave me a lot to think about. Mm-hmm. And I will say, and we'll talk more about this maybe toward the end of the show, that it, I don't know who it's for. I don't know who this movie is for. Having said that, I enjoyed it as someone who likes forensic psychology.
Right.
I don't know that a lot of people want this level of story about this particular character.
What was the other movie where you literally said and I feel like it was another DC movie or something. What was the other movie where you were just like, I don't know who this is for, but I love every second of it. And I cannot remember for the life of me what it was. But it was definitely something that we covered here. And you were just like, I don't know who this is for, but for people like me, I got so much out of it. Okay.
So the last thing I'll say before I ask you is, I certainly can understand why a lot of people did not like this film.
Yeah.
And we'll get into some of that, but it doesn't feel good. It's not entertaining to the degree that
it's a musical, and yet one of the more bleak musicals you would ever be able to imagine.
And I think you had to sign up for that to enjoy it and to kind of experience it for in a way that's fulfilling to you. Mm-hmm. Did you like it? How would you rate this movie?
It's funny. In thinking about it earlier today, as I was trying to decide what it is I really wanted to talk about, I think I talked myself into liking it more.
Okay.
That being said, I was so going in, I wanted to like it, but I was already nervous. Because I very much liked the first movie. I liked the first movie as a condemnation of society and how people with mental illness are mistreated. And yet when they announced the sequel, I knew that it would be hard to ride that same line. And once you introduce someone like Lady Gaga as Harley Quinn, once you announce that it's a jukebox musical, and I tend to shy away from movies like that anyway.
Sure.
I'm not a fan of jukebox musicals. And even musicals are hard for me I was never a musical theater guy. My best friend in the world, big musical theater guy. And that's not to say I don't like certain musicals, but to me, it all needs to make sense. And there were moments in this movie where a song just suddenly appears, and it's almost like they're winking at the audience like, yeah, you're going to have to sit through another one. Here you go. And I found myself bored. Like, the movie was boring to me.
And I think you're right that it is a long movie that could be edited down.
2 hours and 18 minutes.
The songs are long. Some of the scenes kind of get drawn out.
Yeah.
It is ultimately...
And by the way, those musical numbers aren't even... Especially since a lot of them are taking place in sort of a fantasy environment, they're not even photographically all that interesting. Like, they're not...
Right. In some scenes, I don't know, this is getting kind of technical, but in some scenes...
That's what I'm here for.
I know. But it just transitions from a dialogue to singing to a performance, but the elements of the acting... And you might walk out the
door, but that's it. Like,
right, but the elements of the acting don't change.
Yeah.
There are some musical elements where it's a big production, and we can talk about what is that supposed to represent.
Yeah.
But ultimately what I wanted to say is that this is a movie about the trial that follows the story from the first movie.
Yeah.
I did not feel like there was a big story. It did not further his
character.
There is
no story.
No. The Joker, aka Arthur Fleck, it doesn't deepen our understanding of his psychology even, because there's just repeated bits.
That's where I convinced myself earlier today we might not agree.
Okay. So I would say, before, I know we're going to do a deeper dive, but for me, that's why this is a skip it movie. Just see the first one. Unless you want a...
Closure.
Not even that. Like, unless you want the trial. Unless you want a movie about...
And even then, it's only the last hour of the movie.
Yeah. Having said that, I did not feel like his character was further developed. I did not feel like we learned a lot more about Arthur Fleck. I feel like we were introduced to a new character, Harley Quinn, who was not as dynamic as the Harley Quinn characterizations we've seen.
If she didn't interact with other people directly, I'm thinking of like I'm thinking of Catherine Keener's defense attorney for Arthur.
Yeah.
You would think she's
a fantasy.
A fantasy, because she really has no relevance to the movie. Like, there is no... She is one more aspect of society trying to create something that isn't there. And, again, we said this is going to be heavily spoiler territory. But then she just, she pieces out, and you're just like, she really doesn't have much of any real gravitas to the characters or the story of the movie itself.
Yeah.
She is just sort of one more element of Gotham City and the world at large.
Yeah.
So we should say that this does pick up after the first film. He has killed 6 people, only 5 of which are known, because what people may not remember is that he smothered his mother with a pillow, but was not arrested for that crime. He was only arrested for the deaths of 5 people. The most important, and when I say important, I mean the fact that it happened publicly on national television, was the murder of a late night talk show host. And this movie basically follows Arthur in his day-to-day life in prison as he is gearing up for his trial. His defense attorney is Catherine Keener, and she is desperately trying to push this notion of insanity. We can say that you have multiple personality disorder, which I know in 2024 is dissociative identity disorder. However, in the time period in which this takes place, in the early 80s, they're probably still thinking of multiple personality disorder.
Well, so that's the question I was going to ask you. Is this taking place in the early 80s?
Yes,
It's
because
meant
the first,
to be.
yeah. Like the first movie, didn't it like sort of span the gap, or wasn't it like late 70s, early? Because the whole movie was supposed to feel like Taxi Driver. It was supposed to feel like, you know, those gritty, independent films of that era. And just about everything here says, like, you're not going to see anybody with a cell phone.
Got it. Okay.
This,
I wasn't sure if it's meant to just be like an else world, else time, just some timeline or taking place in an era that we would recognize, but is not our world.
It's not stylistic enough to be the Bruce Timm Batman the Animated Series universe, where there's a lot of Art Deco and you're not sure what time period we're in, because there's a lot of modern tech but old clothes. Every man is wearing a fedora, stuff like that. It seems to me to be very grounded in a gritty New York everything being cleaned up and tourism driven. Like you're still going basically into Times Square, and it's just full of like peep shows and, stuff like that. So to me, this is definitely meant to be late 70s, early 80s.
And there are some clear ideas that the defense have in terms of creating a case that Arthur Fleck has some kind of mental illness that involves multiple personalities. I guess, and we hear this a couple of times, there are a few conversations with Catherine Keener, like between the lawyer and Arthur Fleck, where she is appropriately, I don't think there's anything coercive about this.
Yeah.
Appropriately, she tells him, remember that the Joker is a fragmented self. Remember that you are separate from the Joker. So there are these ideas that they're really trying to encourage him to emphasize during his trial, in that he has these alters. And that one alter is responsible for the homicides.
Can I
Oh, yes, you can.
I don't want to say correct you, but could I amend something you're saying? Because this is something that I kept noticing throughout the film.
Okay.
And it seemed interesting to me. And then, of course, it resolves itself at the end, in my opinion.
Okay.
She never, and he never, and in fact, Harley, who goes by Lee in this particular film.
Yeah.
They never refer to him as the Joker. He is simply Joker. And I feel like leaving the word "the" off is super important, because he may not be the Joker.
I noticed at one point someone else calls him the Joker,
yes,
but he never calls himself the Joker.
So
it's
Steve
Joker.
Coogan, who's playing a reporter, is sitting in a cell, and he's like, "So are you Arthur or are you the Joker?" And then she says, "We talked about this. The rules are you can't call him Joker."
Yeah.
So she removes "the," and they just constantly refer to Joker, Joker, Joker as being the alternate personality within Arthur. So this is why I've convinced myself that I like it more. This is why I needed a little bit more time, I think, away from the movie to really sort of stew in what I liked and disliked about it. Ultimately, what I disliked about it is exactly what I said. I just found it to be dull and lifeless.
Sure.
I was just bored throughout most of the movie. Everyone's interested in Travis Bickle in Taxi Driver. You don't want to see Travis Bickle's trial. Like, we don't care. It's too grounded in reality to care.
Fair.
Except for the bleak musical numbers. Here's what I did like about it. And I want to get your take on this. It's ultimately why we're here. If the first movie was a condemnation on society and how we mistreat people with mental illness, the second movie was almost a continuation of that, in that society desperately wanted him to be a monster. They desperately wanted him to be Joker. Society wanted him to be the John Wayne Gacy, the Ted Bundy. Like they needed to know that who they're talking to is the guy who killed 5 people.
Yes.
In their minds.
The reporter wanted an exclusive, salacious, deep, horrific, unsettling interview with this killer. And that's how they're trying to portray
Harley wanted the same thing. It's revealed that, and we could go into this in greater detail, but it ultimately, her arc is that he meets her in a sort of choir class. She lies to him and says that she grew up in the same neighborhood he did, that she walked the same steps he danced down famously every day on her way to school or whatever. Her father was abusive and has died, or other way around. Her father has died. Her mother was abusive, similar to Arthur's, and her mother's the one who had her committed. It's later revealed all of that is a lie. She committed herself voluntarily. She was able to walk out whenever she wanted. Her parents were both alive. They lived in the Upper West Side, hoity-toity, rich neighborhood. Her father's a doctor. Harleen went to grad school for psychiatry, which you immediately turned to me and you're like, no, don't go to grad school.
No, she didn't. No, she didn't. They say she went to grad school for psychiatry. You go to med school for psychiatry. You go to grad school for psychology. And look,
maybe Catherine Keener just doesn't know the difference.
No. I think so. I'll say a couple things. Lazy writing. If you're going to go through an entire explanation in this court drama about multiple personalities and have many psychologists, testify and provide their assessments, all this stuff, at least get this right. This is simple. So I think that's kind of lazy. I think they just didn't check.
But I'm glad you're saying that, because that's what's bringing me to the thing that I liked. And that is, there's one scene in particular that sold me. And I remember being so super impressed. So Todd Phillips, who is the director and the co-writer of the film, seems to be saying something very specific, which is that mental illness does not make a killer. And the reason I say that is because society as a whole keeps driving this: you're mentally ill, you're mentally ill, you're mentally ill. You didn't kill these people. Joker did it. You didn't do this. The monster inside you did it, etc. Everybody wants that. They all want the guy in the red suit with the gold vest and the face paint. No one wants Arthur. And a psychiatrist is up on the stand and says, look, I spent 89 minutes with him, and I've reviewed all of the previous paperwork and all of that. And I'm here to say, I can diagnose him potentially with 4 mild mental illnesses, none of which explain why he killed 6 people.
Yeah.
And that's exactly right. Like, yes, his mental illness didn't do this.
We have to take a pause here, because we need to go back to the plea. So legally, is this lawyer saying that Arthur Fleck is pleading not guilty by reason of insanity.
Right.
So we have to kind of start there, and then I'll answer your question.
And I feel like in the late 70s, early 80s, this must have been the golden era of defense attorneys wanting to use mental illness as the
absolutely
as the
and we need reason. To kind of like unpack that a little bit and define that better, because insanity is a legal term, not a clinical term, not a psychiatric term.
Yes.
So when we say not guilty by reason of insanity, it's NGRI. It's a phrase. That means that the person in question, the person in this case, Arthur Fleck, their attorney is saying at the time that the crime was committed, this person, because he has a mental illness, did not know right from wrong during the time of the crime. So that's one state of mind. They have to actually prove that. Now, back in the late 70s and 80s, it was actually the prosecution that needed to show evidence that this person is that the person who's on trial was sane. So in other words, the prosecution in the 70s and way before the 70s needed to demonstrate that the alleged murderer was sane at the time of the crime. They understood that while they were behaving in this way, acting out on these heinous things, that they understood the difference between right and wrong and did it anyway. Things changed in the early 80s, where it then, in the US at least, moved to the defense. The defense needs to demonstrate that at the time of the crime, their client was insane. So the onus is on them. And that's why it was important to figure out, like, wait, when is this taking place?
Although if I remember correctly, I'm pretty sure I do here. She introduces the idea to the audience by saying, you're going to go visit this doctor who is already hypothesizing that you have another identity within you. So in other words, a very defense-friendly psychiatrist. That person then sort of tries to lead him down a path of, am I talking to the other person? Very much leading the witness in that path. And this is pre-trial. So this was a determination, is he sane enough to stand trial? So she couldn't necessarily plead not guilty by reason of insanity. She may have tried.
That's what I didn't understand.
But then they announced in the news, they announced on the news that he was then determined sane enough to stand trial.
No. So this is where you have two separate competency tests. The first competency test is the client competent to be on trial? Mm-hmm. So that means and you're right, they get these assessments. Yeah. There's mental health professionals and evaluators who determine that the client can be stable during the time of the trial.
Yeah.
That's one evaluation. And you're right, in the beginning of the film, they determined that Arthur Fleck was competent to stand trial.
Got it, but that's different.
Different.
So you're competent enough to stand trial, but you may have still been insane in the moment of the crime.
You got it. Got it. The only thing that the defense has to do is prove that at the time of the murder, Arthur Fleck did not know right from wrong because of his mental illness.
And did not know fantasy from reality.
Could be that. That could be the reason. They're going with the multiple personalities, which we can get into. Historically, that has not been very successful in our courts, but it is considered a mental illness. Historically, schizophrenia is usually the most common mental illness that's used for the insanity defense. But with NGRI, you do not have to show that your client consistently or always doesn't know right from wrong. Just at the time of the crime, did they know what was going on? Did they understand that ending this person's life is morally wrong? Or could they not make that judgment in the impulsivity, the passion, the
which is
delusion?
Why they say if
are
you
they
planned anything,
yes,
then,
exactly.
Like if you've gone in with a plan, you knew in that moment that what you were doing was going to take the life of this person. You knew that it was right versus wrong, right or wrong. Like the difference, which is why they everyone constantly says like, oh, anyone who picks up a gun and kills a bunch of people must be crazy. And you're like,
we got to be really careful with this because an interest in violence and behaving in violent ways, homicidal and violent behavior in and of itself, that doesn't mean you have a mental illness.
Right.
Having said that, sociopathy, which in our clinical world is antisocial personality disorder, disregarding the rules, lack of care and compassion and empathy for other people's feelings, sometimes acting in ways that are that violate the law. Those could be considered a part of a mental illness. The insanity defense is not going to work for someone who simply is a sociopath. In other words, someone willing to kill people, that alone, having a disregard for the law, having lack of remorse, simply do not care for another person's life. While that can be considered a long-standing personality disorder, that is not going to be a successful defense here, because that person definitely knows right from wrong at the time of the murder, and you did not care. You kill people and you don't care, you're not going to use the insanity plea.
Now, what's interesting about Arthur's plea or defense is the lawyer and the psychiatrist who's there to sort of be on his side. They keep making the case that the environment created this killer, that his mistreatment, the bullying, the downright mean way that his mother even treated him and talked about him privately to other people, is sort of what drove him to do this, to the degree that at one point he fires his lawyer. He's tired of feeling like she isn't doing right by him, and he is being heavily manipulated by Harleen in the courtroom at this point. She is actively taking this is why I say that it seemed very Fight Clubby. Like it was almost like she is the Joker part of him.
I've never seen Fight Club, remember? So I don't know.
Oh, so it's almost like she was it's an older movie. Spoilers. It's almost like she was the
shadow self.
The shadow self.
Yeah.
Who says, at one point he is talking to someone on the stand. It's Puddles, the little person who was also a clown in the first movie, who is in the room when he kills the guy in the apartment. And he says, well, yeah, but he was kind of a bully, right? Like and Puddles is like, he didn't deserve to die for being a bully. And at this point, Arthur's in full makeup and in regalia, and he's like, but didn't he deserve to die because he was a bully? So he is even bought in to his own defense at that point, that the world made him who he was, and that he was only killing
if you are a bad person, you deserve to die. Absolutely.
Right.
My mother. Yeah. So Arthur Fleck's moral
compass,
his moral framework is, if you are bad to me, you deserve to die.
Right. So one could argue, I would say, if you were the defense attorney, one would argue that's the difference between right and wrong as perceived by you, and the argument of right and wrong as perceived by him, is that you would say no one deserves to die because they bullied you, and he would say, no, the right thing to do is to kill the people who mistreat me. And so you could argue Well, he didn't know the difference between right and wrong, because for him, the perception of what is right and what is wrong and what is justice and injustice is entirely askew from everyone else.
That's his version of justice. So let's complicate this a little further, because I think a lawyer could say what you're saying, right? The couple things I wanted to mention, first thing about Harley Quinn is that I love where you're going in that what if everything since the moment he glanced at her in that hospital ward
was it Jacob's Ladder syndrome?
Was like, since then, like they met eyes, but since that point, she has been either a fantasy or a hallucination, and she is taken the form of his shadow self.
And we should say that the very beginning of this movie opens up with a Looney Tunes style animated cartoon that follows the Joker as he steps out onto a stage, like the Marie whatever show, and his shadow self, which is literally his shadow, similar to like Peter Pan, peels itself up, puts the face paint on it, goes out and is more charming, is more charismatic than he is, leaves him naked. He comes out and is embarrassed. The shadow self continues to sing a song, hands him the microphone as three cops, Keystone Cop-ish type characters, hoof their way into the studio. And that's when the shadow self abandons him, becomes his shadow, dresses him up in the clothes, and allows him to take the major beating from the three cops. So they're setting up from the beginning that there is a shadow self.
And I don't know that people know that that's what that could have been interpreted as, Arthur Fleck has this impulsive self or this alter who's like a little bit more misbehaved.
But even in that cartoon, Arthur is the victim.
Exactly.
In
this version, the shadow self is depicted as being independent from Arthur, and not only is driving the behavior, but in analytical psychology, the shadow self is the suppressed and sometimes like hidden unconscious impulses and desires and qualities that are a part of us but don't necessarily drive all of our behavior. We have different moral and ego level mechanisms that kind of keep that balanced and at bay. These are socially unacceptable and sometimes negative behaviors that maybe all of us have a little tendency to think about or may have intrusive thoughts about, but no, it's not a socially appropriate thing to do. So the shadow self in this little cartoon in the beginning violates a woman, like kisses her without her consent, undresses Arthur, like does all these like in some ways silly and in some ways, really offensive things. And then you're right, leaves Arthur to deal with the consequences. And I don't know. I think that for me means that we're going to see a struggle between a part of Arthur that is inherently interested in misbehavior and violence and violating people, and then a part of Arthur who is submissive and sad and helpless and who doesn't want to be that person. Now that would be evidence for this DID defense.
But that's who we're introduced to in the beginning is the sad one who they say for weeks hasn't delivered a joke. It's very clear that when he first got there, every day he greeted them with a different bad joke, and they celebrated him for that. Whether it was bullying or not, he somehow got preferential treatment because they constantly make fun of him by being like, "Oh, no joke today? Or you don't have a joke?" And then when he asks for a cigarette in the yard, they say, you don't get one unless you give us a joke. Like they've turned this into a game. And it has created an uncomfortable friendship between him and the guards to some degree. Like there is a, like they don't really come down hard on him until he turns on them. Whereas they remain mean and brutish to the other members of the
guards,
community.
The guards are in of themselves another representation of the potential for good-natured, good social behavior, and their shadow selves who come through toward the end of the movie. And that's the most brutal we've seen them, is when they've been actually just kind of verbally insulted by somebody.
Yeah, just on TV. And so it then turns them against him and they brutally assault him. It's implied that there may have even been an assault of a sexual nature in the bathroom. I thought so too. But it's not explicitly, like they sort of strip him of his clothes and knock him down to the ground, and they just sort of hover over him, and then we fade away as they're then dragging him back to his cell, but it's not explicitly said. And by the way, this is one of those things that I disliked about the movie, and it very well may have been part of Todd Phillips' whole strategy was, yes, we're going to keep introducing characters and we're going to keep bringing up plot points that are never then addressed again. During that scene where they throw him into his cell, or in the aftermath of that scene when they throw him into sort of a solitary confinement, one of the young boys who's sort of idolized him from the beginning begins speaking up for him. Brendan Gleeson's character, Jackie Sullivan, I believe was his name, he pulls the kid out, and we hear through the door that Jackie strangles the kid to death, like just holds him. And in fact, you start to hear the other cops being like, hey, he can't breathe. Yeah. He can't breathe. And then you hear them thud, and you hear one of the other cops say he's gone. So we knew instantly the moment we even met that kid, oh, he ain't making it to the end of this movie. But that is never again addressed. Like it, and it's so to me.
What do you mean it's not again addressed?
We never go back. Like the cops, there are never repercussions for the cops. No one addresses the fact that the kid died. We don't know what happened to him. Like the news doesn't cover it the way that it would today. There's no one brings up the assault in the shower. No one brings up any of this. And one might say, well, Todd Phillips has created a bunch of loose threads that these things happen and then we never touch on them again. But okay. I think part of his point is that no one is ever going to talk about this again. There
you go. Yeah. And that's how I understood it, is that the acts of brutality, including the assault on Arthur Fleck, that he didn't deserve. You know, it's interesting because of all the people we're supposed to follow and relate to, you know, the protagonist is Arthur Fleck, and he's admitted to murdering a bunch of people, and we saw it in the first movie. Like that's our protagonist. We still understand that he doesn't deserve to be treated like, like an object this way, to be assaulted and beat and violated this way. And I agree with you that there are instances that for me at least didn't feel like loose threads. They felt like exposing something really unsettling, and
with society,
you just know it's there.
Yeah.
So it's in the room with you, and it doesn't get fixed. There's no social justice for that. It just, or criminal justice for that, rather. It just hangs there. Yeah.
The one thing that I truly enjoyed, and I'm not going to say enjoyed. The one thing I appreciated is that at a moment in which Arthur is giving his closing statement, and he's dressed as the Joker, and he sits down on a stool, and he's got a microphone, he's staring at the camera, the TV cameras, broadcasting out to all these CRT TVs. That should have been your first indication that this was 70s, 80s. He breaks down, and he he then admits, I can't be who you want me to be. So even the burden of being Joker is too much for him. And he basically says, there is no Joker. Just Arthur. I'm just Arthur Fleck. I killed those 6 people. Mm-hmm. I did this. You know, he is to the camera, both for the audience in Gotham City and for the audience in the theaters, telling us there's no such thing as DID, at least in my case. I did this. I had my reasons for doing this, and I cannot continue this facade of being this clown character that you desperately want or need me to be. It is too stressful to be this character. And he and in that moment, his shadow self, Harleen, stands up and leaves. She abandons him. And so does a number of other supporters in the courtroom. Mm-hmm. And then in the moment that I think might be one of the ones that you're alluding to from earlier, that's when a car bomb goes off outside and blows the courtroom up, and he is freed from the courtroom temporarily. But to me, that moment was the most important moment in the movie, the moment that Arthur reflected and admitted that Arthur Fleck did this, not Joker. And to sort of wrap up his story, and again, it's one of those things that's so painfully predictable. The moment we see this other character, you know, just like the kid, Arthur ain't getting through this movie.
No. Like and there's, before you wrap that up, because I know where you're going with that.
Yeah.
I think you're right. I think that moment that Arthur looks straight into the camera, because prior to that, his antics in the courtroom have been very laughable. Like actually, like if you were in the courtroom, you'd just be like,
he's doing an Andy Griffith sort of Perry Mason.
He was doing like a Southern accent. He was doing a, there was one point, very serious, like interrogation style.
By the way,
persona.
That scene, and again, it's the scene with puddles, right? Like, that scene is one of the most horrific in the first movie, is seeing, I appreciate that actor's performance so much, because in that first movie, when he kills the boss or whatever in his apartment, and he does it in front of Puddles, and I think it's like John Puddles or something. And there's a whole joke made about whether your last name is actually Puddles. That guy is genuinely terrified in that scene. I mean, you would think that Joaquin Phoenix did something to him in between takes to make him actually fear Joaquin Phoenix.
Sure.
As opposed to Joker. He's so convincing, and you feel for him instantly. And in this scene, it is the most, it's the scene I appreciate the most, because he is practically peeing himself on the way to the stand, explains that he is terrified, explains that he didn't want to be here in front of Joker, and refers to him as Arthur. And he's like, I was never scared of you, but I'm scared of him. I'm scared of Joker. And you were the only one who never made fun of me. You were the only one who treated me like a person. You're the only one who never made me feel small until the moment that you killed this other guy. And then I felt so small and so helpless. And again, he steals the movie, because in this scene, even Joker, you see on his face, the facade drops for a moment. He's still behind the face paint, but the facade drops. He then says, I think that's sort of the scene that ultimately leads to him realizing, because he doesn't understand. He's like, but you're the one, like, I was never going to hurt you. I told you I wasn't going to hurt you, and I never did. Like, why are you so scared of me now? Not understanding that what he did is terrifying to anyone in that room. And this actor was just so good in it. And I hope to see a lot more of him. Unfortunately, there aren't a whole lot of roles, like great roles for, little people actors, but there need to be, because this guy was just incredible.
Well, and you make a good point, because the people who are testifying during this trial are clear, very descriptive and direct, that the person who murdered these people was willfully murdering these people, that they came across, like, and by the way, this is Harvey Dent's case. Like, I don't know, we didn't mention too much that the prosecution is attorney Harvey Dent and
assistant DA. The guy looks like he's 25. Yeah, and he's already the assistant DA of Gotham City.
It's very surprising how he looks, but he's got a solid case, because these folks are witnesses. They're character witnesses. They're psychologists. They are people that knew Arthur Fleck and saw the destructive and antisocial and violent behavior and cannot attest that that was a different person.
Yeah.
Like, no one had any convincing story that there was a switch to a different persona or alter, and that's Joker.
I would argue that Puddles is the closest thing, because Puddles did say, "This isn't you, Art." Like he never refers to him as Joker. He continually refers to him as Arthur and says, "I don't understand. I was never scared of you until." So I would say that his was the most realistic example of someone who may have said, you were someone and then you were not that person again.
To answer your question about the childhood abuse, isolation, adverse events that Arthur experienced, and how those experiences led to his violent behavior, what I would argue is that it doesn't excuse, obviously it doesn't excuse someone from, being guilty of murder, but you're onto something there, because while Arthur, again, we don't know what his plea was, but while it's really difficult for his lawyer to demonstrate enough evidence, to give enough evidence that he did not know right from wrong, that he was insane at the time of the crime taking place, what we all can agree on is that this is a disturbed individual. And I like that you mentioned what Dr. Victor Liu said, the psychologist who had assessed him, and said, look, he does have mental disorders that we need to acknowledge. He has chronic sadness. He's depressed. He has narcissism, so they noted that he seems to misunderstand other people's needs and put his before them. He mentioned friendlessness, which, I think attends to our understanding that Arthur cannot make social and interpersonal connections and is chronically lonely. And then Dr. Liu says, but look, there's no psychiatric defense here, which is to your point, right?
Yeah.
And I like that. It's complicated, but it means he may have all of these different mental disorders and deficits. And I would actually add some psychotic disorder, because I believe some of these fantasies are at the level of hallucination or delusion, that sometimes it's unclear to me whether he's really seeing these things. It's unclear to me whether he actually believes, he inflates.
I never got that sense. Because every time they would go into like a musical number that was in his mind, when they came back, he never was shocked that it wasn't there.
No,
there was never a I'm still here. Like, there was never a belief that he was there. Right. He would just allow he would just seek solace in his own imagination.
I'm leaning more, and I thought about this in the very first movie when he was fantasizing about having a romantic partner with the neighbor.
Yeah.
That we learned later, because in the movie we thought that was real, and we learned later that was imagined. I did initially feel as though most of his a lot of his hyperphantasia, I thought, was mostly an imagination, a fantasy, a comfort in, but what would it look like if I were loved? What would it look like if I was adored? What would it look like if people saw this talent that is within me?
Yeah.
Those are fantasies, yes. When does it turn into, for me, the reason I said there could be some psychoticism here is that I'm not sure how much he believes that those fantasies are real. Like in the moment of the fantasy, how indulgent and how real does it feel to him? Moreover, let's put hallucinations aside. Let's rule that out. Moreover, the delusions are potentially more compelling to me. That does he have these long-standing beliefs in bizarre ideas and stories that are not grounded in reality? I think so. I think sometimes he gets so lost in his fantasy that he might start to believe those ideas and carry them with him.
One could argue, and I noticed this in the framing, and I think it's sort of what we were talking about earlier when it comes to Harley, is that it's shot in such a way where you find yourself as the viewer going, I don't believe this. Like, I don't think it's true. Like, oh, a guard let me in.
Oh, for
and
sure.
we had sex in solitary confinement.
Yeah, describe that. Well, not describe that, but describe that scene, because I was scratching my head too.
So there's a scene where they are watching a movie, and it's a musical with Fred Astaire, and she decides she wants to leave and go outside, and he says, I can't. And she then sets the place on fire so that everybody goes outside. And admittedly, they weren't trying to escape. At no point in time did they make a run for it. They simply wanted to be together outside. And it's seen as an escape attempt, and he is thrown into solitary confinement. And she suddenly shows up and is like, oh, there's my boy. And he's like, oh, how did you get in here? And she's like, somebody let me in. And then they end up having sex. Later, she says that she's pregnant. But at no point in time is this shot in a way that feels real. It feels like a fantasy. So many of these moments with her feel like a fantasy. And if she hadn't been on the news with Catherine Keener right there in the thick of it, where she comes up and yells at her for being a bad attorney, and then the news reporters start asking her questions, you would think her entire existence was a delusion or an illusion, whichever one.
A fantasy. Yeah.
But there are certain scenes that feel like Todd Phillips has specifically said in his own mind, this didn't actually happen. Mm-hmm. So not all of them, but some of them. So it's sort of to your point where you're like, well, maybe they met eyes, but then they just never interacted again. I do think the moment in the cell is something that didn't happen.
So you are convinced that...
I'm not going to say I'm convinced. I'm saying it's shot in a way that it's ambiguous enough that if someone asked Todd Phillips, was she there or not, he could be like, was she?
Was she? So is it possible that...
Even the last scene with her.
Is it possible that in isolation, in solitary confinement, rather, that the lack of sensory comfort and the extended period of loneliness and the
because he was supposed to be in there for 2 weeks.
The nutritional deprivation, all of these different psychological, neurobiological, and physical deficits, that alone could lead to a hallucination. I would actually argue in the way that manifested, to me, that felt like a self-soothing fantasy that he came up with to feel better about what was going on for him.
Except you could then say on the flip side, there's an important piece of information that comes out in that scene that otherwise wouldn't have, which is that
he couldn't.
They are letting her go.
Oh, I was going to say something else.
No, she says they're sending me home. And he's like, why? And she said, well, because they're trying to separate us. You're a bad influence on me,
right.
Et cetera. But that's good because it means I can be there for every day of your court trial. I can be there, whatever. So in other words, they just went like, oh, because Joker's here, we're going to let you leave. But then Catherine Keener then says later, they didn't send her home. She checked herself out. She was a voluntary patient. She checked herself out and left. And so without that moment in solitary confinement, he wouldn't have known she was leaving. And so that piece of information is revealed in that scene.
And her telling him when she visits him in prison that she's pregnant. Now, I actually do not believe her.
I absolutely do not, because we've already established her as a liar.
Yeah, I don't believe her. But why would she say that had they not had that moment together while he was in solitary confinement? So there's some pieces here that feel absolutely not grounded in reality, but then we get evidence in the script why that actually could have happened, very likely that happened.
Exactly. And then there's those moments, by the way, the best line in that particular scene where she visits him and they're talking between, there's the plexiglass between them. And she's like, did you know that I moved into your old apartment building just so that we could build a home together when you're out? And he's like, you did? I don't want to live there. Like, it's like, this great little, this great little genuine moment of, I don't want to live there. That was so cool.
So Dr. Liu actually never mentions any type of psychotic disorder like schizophrenia, which maybe this is helpful because I believe Dr. Liu was a thorough assessor. My understanding is that he did his job.
Yeah. And what I like about Dr. Liu, it was used against him by the defense attorney. But she says, how long were you actually with Arthur? And he says 2 hours. And she said, actually, it was 89 minutes. Do you really think you could diagnose him in 89 minutes? And I was like, okay, A, that's a fair point. But B, to your point, especially dating back to like the early stages of this podcast where I would say, oh, what's wrong with Joker? Oh, what's wrong with Penguin? And you're like, well, I've not spent enough time with them. Yeah. Like, he was unable to spend enough time to say anything conclusively about him, except that I do not believe he has another identity.
Well, first of all,
I do not believe that mental illness is what killed these people. And so I appreciated that because even you have been like 89 minutes. That's not enough time for me to assess somebody.
He countered back. He did clap back and he said, I have reviewed the materials, and this client has been in social services for several years. There's tons of therapy notes and other clinical and diagnostic information that this professional can draw from.
Plus his own diary.
89 minutes, yeah. So 89 minutes, look, you're going to bill the 2 hours. So it's 2 hours. But 89 minutes doesn't strike me as too long or not long enough, whatever. I think what matters is that when we see Arthur in clinical interviews or in any type of interview, he may not be forthcoming. He may not be a reliable reporter of his own history. Yeah. While we know that he's had a troubled past, we don't know how much of that is real and how much of that is imagined or fabricated intentionally. So I believe that amount of time sounds to me like it is sufficient for him to come up with this diagnostic profile. The other thing,
but he's also not trying to diagnose him so much as he is saying
he's ruling out some things.
He's ruling out some things.
And in particular, Dr. Liu did not find evidence for what we now know as DID, but what that defense lawyer is claiming is multiple personality disorder, that there's some kind of what they call on the movie split personality. And I'm glad they never got too much into like more labels and descriptors because I didn't quite understand what they meant by split personality, and they left it up to interpretation.
Yeah.
But my understanding was...
Which would have been the case in the 80s anyway.
I know.
It would have been the sexy thing to put on TV.
Yeah. But does the name John Hinckley seem familiar to you?
Yeah.
What do you know about John Hinckley?
He attempted the assassination of a president.
Yeah. So he was...
and you know he didn't succeed because he doesn't have a middle name.
Yeah. So Hinckley was judged to be not guilty by reason of insanity.
Yes.
Meeting the criteria at the time for being insane at the time of his crime. And so he spent the rest of his life in a mental hospital. So that's the other thing that I want to frame here, is that even though this outcome was different, if this lawyer was going for the NGRI outcome, that does not necessarily mean that Arthur would have been let go into the streets of Gotham. He would have been, and she mentioned this earlier in the movie, you need a higher level of care. You need to be in a mental hospital, not here in this prison.
Catherine Keener, yeah.
Yeah. And so she
keeps saying too that she's the only one who truly cares about him. That she's the only, like, no one else is going to give you the treatment or the care that I will. I mean, I thought she was very compassionate. She's very compassionate. She's very professional, but she is almost also one of those people who has latched on to him in some way.
Yeah.
Now, the difference between someone like Harley or any number of other folks is that she seems to be doing it out of that compassionate, I need to make sure you go to a hospital.
You've got to be
not
taken
to this
care
prison.
of. You got to be okay.
Yeah.
When he comes out of the rain, because the guards don't give him an umbrella and he's soaked, he's going from E ward to B ward. Or some other one. I can't remember. She gives him a coat. And look, this Catherine Keener genuinely cares about the well-being of this person.
Yeah.
She knows he has killed multiple people. She knows that he is guilty of that, but she understands that he is unwell, and I don't think she's trying to manipulate the judge. I think she honestly believes that Joker is some deeply unconscious, hidden entity, alter within Arthur that provokes him and that drives this behavior. I truly believe that about her. Now, does the name Menendez, Menendez brothers, does that ring a bell? Yeah. So the Menendez brothers have this Netflix,
very much in the news right now.
Yes, they have this Netflix drama about them. Another outcome.
We should also say that Arthur also had a TV movie made about him.
Yes, yeah.
That Harley says she watched 20 times and then later admits probably closer to 4.
Now, do you think Ryan Murphy made that?
He would.
Arthur Fleck movie.
If it were today, Ryan Murphy would be making it, and Joker would be like
so sexy
with everybody.
Not quite the conventionally attractive man in this film, Arthur Fleck.
They try real hard to prove that. The very first time you see him, and he's like putting on his clothes, getting up from his bed, and you just sit there and wonder how much of it is computer, because God, how can someone's shoulder blades come out that, like, just jut out that far?
He's so emaciated. It looks very scary.
What must he have done to his body to get that?
So I bring up the Menendez brothers because they claim to have endured a tremendous amount of childhood abuse in their past. And what didn't happen during their trial was a lesser sentencing because of the idea, not that they were insane during the murder of their parents, which they admit to, but that the long-standing history of abuse influenced their sense of safety, and their only recourse was to murder their parents.
Yeah.
That didn't work in their initial trial, and now there's, I guess, new evidence emerging that someone else has come forward about potential abuse by their late father. So there's another outcome that could have been helpful for Arthur, and that would have been the guilty but mentally ill plea, or the guilty but mentally ill status, which is a verdict saying that, yes, he did these things and he's guilty, but he is mentally ill and he should be placed in a state hospital with more care, ongoing close treatment, interventions that are going to help him to get better and be less interested in antisocial behavior and violence. His aggression, his anger, his helplessness, all these feelings would be mitigated by this treatment. And I think that could have been a likely outcome for Arthur. But I also don't understand, if we look back to the beginning of this film, how they set up Arkham is that this isn't Arkham Asylum, this is Arkham State Hospital. Or did you understand that one wing was Arkham Prison and the other wing was Arkham State Hospital? That was the part that confused me.
So it's all sort of prison-ish in that when we go to B ward where she is, it says minimum security.
Why is she in? If she voluntarily admits to,
and we don't even know if what she said she did was
got
true.
it. Okay.
She said she tried to she lit her mom's building on fire, but that's also during the same time that she was lying about the fact that her father was dead. Meanwhile, her parents both live in a house in the Upper West Side.
Sure.
So she clearly never. She may be genuinely. A pyromaniac to some degree, because she certainly did try to burn down the entire ward. But my understanding is that she probably never actually tried to burn down her mother's building, because her mother didn't actually live there. They lived in a house or some nice, brownstone somewhere or something. But she admits that she checked herself in specifically to meet Arthur. Like she was a groupie.
Yeah.
And
But you can't check yourself into a prison.
That's what I'm saying is I don't even necessarily. Also, I'm not sure this was Arkham. Was this actually?
The sign said, I
did?
was looking for it. So a couple things. His shirt said Arkham. And
You're right.
I was like, I want that shirt.
Yeah, I remember seeing that
And
shirt.
the guards had towels that said Arkham. And then out on the very front. So the way this is, it's almost like I don't know how to call it when it's like an island but not big enough. There's a word for that. I'll think of it later.
This was an island. It was similar to Alcatraz. It's an island, but it's
just the building. It's just the facility that's on this island.
Yeah, it's modeled off of Alcatraz. The only way in or out is a single road going to the island.
Isthmus.
Yeah.
Anyway, I understood it to be a lockdown facility where one wing you have a prison.
But the further you go down the letters, so he's an E ward.
Yeah.
He is now, from B to E, that much more security, that much more. But even that doesn't make sense per se, because Brendan Gleeson's character, was it Jackie Sullivan, gets him permission to go to B ward to be a part of this choir group, and part of it seems to be self-serving because Jackie fancies himself as a bit of a crooner, and so he's like, well, if you get to go to this singing thing, that I can go and I can perform too. So it is interesting. You wouldn't necessarily think someone from E can just casually go to B to participate in song therapy, which, by the way, we should just make this particular part of the discussion just a standalone Patreon, where we discuss song therapy, because it was seemingly run by not just a music teacher, but
that was a counselor.
But it was a counselor. That
counselor didn't say anything I thought was inaccurate.
I mean, they didn't say very much at all, but
no. But he said,
but it was also during a very
can be helpful. Singing is cathartic.
Yeah.
Singing, you could tell your story,
and you don't have to do it if you're not feeling it. Like you sing when you're ready to sing. And notice we never saw Arthur sing in class. The first time we see Arthur sing is when the two of them are sitting at the windows together, and she begins to sing sort of to him, and he responds in song. So the two of them have now made this connection. But I also think that during this time period, it would have been the heyday of people trying to do a lot more of that new age, or, you know, at the risk of sounding disparaging, the sort of hippy dippy therapies of like, welcome to 1981. Today, we're going to do therapy through song.
Look, well, so even today, even though it sounds hippy dippy, inpatient psych wards often have various group sessions and classes. Yeah. And especially for people who are residents for a very long time, these creative and expression, these what I would consider like art therapy types of experiences can be helpful. Not so much, and yes, because maybe some people feel it's cathartic to get their feelings and ideas and impulses out in ways that are nonverbal. But also there's a social skills element to it. Like you spend time with one another, you get to know other people, you relearn how to engage in more positive ways, and you're monitored. So
that is a good point.
There's lots of different elements that I think can be therapeutic.
You know that one of my favorite documentaries that I worked on the DVD for many years ago was a documentary called Shakespeare Behind Bars. And it's a fly-on-the-wall documentary that follows a maximum security prison group who performs one Shakespeare play a year. And in this particular case, they're doing The Tempest. And it's fascinating because you're looking at these gigantic, in some cases, just behemoth men, and they're terrifying to look at. I think part of that is because you know they're in prison. And then they're like, yeah, I'm learning this character, and I really feel like I get it because this character's a monster, and I was seen as a monster, and you're like, oh, what's happening? You know, and suddenly you start to really feel for these people, and in some cases, it's so validating to know that people can overcome the worst things they've ever done in their lives. Like there's this one character or this one person who's like, yeah, I really feel like I know this character a lot because they were seen as a monster. And then you hear the interviewer off camera go like, what did you do to get here? And he's like, killed 2 people. And you're just like, wait, what? And he's like, yeah, walked in, found my lady with another guy, strangled her, killed him, strangled her to death. And you're like, and he's like, but this character, I can really feel. And you're like, oh, I'm now like, you see the dichotomy there. And these plays are genuinely helping this person understand right and wrong, like what, all this stuff. And so it's a fascinating documentary. I recommend people check it out. But similar to what you're saying, yes, these art therapy, but what I meant when I said that was I feel like the late 70s, early 80s is like where like this would have been, hey, what can we throw at the wall to see what sticks? And this could have been one of those things.
Speaking of interventions, there's a moment where Arthur tells Harley Quinn he's stopped taking his medication. Yeah. She tells him, you've got to stop taking your medication. To your point, she is I almost said in love. No, she's in lust and obsessed with Joker.
But this is also in that the solitary confinement scene.
Unclear if it really happened.
Unclear, but when she says you need to stop taking your medication and he says I already have, that then sets up the idea that she's not actually there.
Yeah. And what would he have been taking? He would have been taking mood stabilizers.
3 pills. Yeah. Did you recognize the colors of any of those?
A light blue one, a light pink one, and a white one.
There was like a yellow one or something. Like when we looked down, I thought it was like 2 white ones and a yellow one or something like that. I don't remember.
No, there's no label on them. I don't know. If we're going with the time frame, it could be lithium. It could be any kind of mood stabilizer. What we do know from his behavior is that, to your point, he was growing more and more lethargic and introverted and quiet and kind of solemn, kept to himself. He's always been a bit of an introvert. He's always been a loner. And I think that's what had scared a lot of people about him initially, as the first movie portrayed. But when he stopped taking his medication, he became more outgoing. He was more playful. He started to make his jokes again with the guards.
As unfunny as ever.
Yeah, but he would kind of... I loved what you said about his time in court when he would put on... It's almost like he's a child putting on and practicing these different personas. Like, what if I sounded like this? Would this be the kind of guy that would interrogate this person? And that's not DID. That's not multiple personality disorder. That's somebody who, based on what we know about him, he truly doesn't like who he is. He doesn't genuinely like Arthur. And
his whole thing was, and it's brought up again in this movie, his mother told him that he was put on this earth to make people happy and to make them laugh. And he bought into that so hard that even though nothing he says is funny, he's so desperately trying to be funny, to be entertaining. And that is what he's doing in that courtroom, where he's suddenly trying to be Matlock, an Andy Griffith character.
He's not entertaining in the way he wants to be entertaining.
Right. But he thinks he is.
Right. So it's these, again, I'd say immature fantasies and ideas that he comes up with, that he's playing around with. This is somebody who's, this Joker is very different than all the other Jokers we've talked about. But what's consistent is that just like all the other Jokers, there's a boredom. There's a boredom with things as they are. He's understimulated. So there's a moment in the prison where like a stereotypical lunchroom fight breaks out.
Yeah.
And it's all chaotic and people are physically rushing each other and throwing punches. And he's fine. He's just kind of in his element. And there's a sense that he's even enjoying it. So again, it's this experience of stress, experience of adrenaline as something that feels good, as something that is actually stimulating and something recognizable. When it's not like that, there's no chaos, there's no violence, it's boring.
Yeah.
So he needs to do something in his life to amp up the adrenaline, amp up the feelings that make him feel alive. The other piece about this, and this is ultimately how I feel about Arthur Fleck, is that he's ultimately wanting to matter. So whether it's figuring out that he could be Joker in the courtroom, or having this woman be interested in him and having this future with him, or even a lawyer showing genuine interest in him, he wants to be special. He wants to matter. He wants to have a purpose. And he's latching onto these things. Notice he kisses the lawyer like twice. It very inappropriately. Like she says something to him that's kind of nice before they go to trial, and he plants this quick kiss on her on the lips. It's kind of, it's not good. It does not feel good to watch that because she does not want it.
And then it happens too right before the Coogan interview, like they're in the control room, whatever.
And it doesn't he do it when he fires her? Like he does,
no,
or he hugs her or something.
No, because he yells at her when he fires her. He says, "I can't take it anymore." Like he stands up in the courtroom and says, "I can't take it anymore. You're fired." And then she's like, "What are you doing?" Whatever. And that's when all chaos, breaks out.
Yeah. So he doesn't. I guess the point that I'm making is that his reading of cues interpersonally is a huge deficit of his. He doesn't quite know how to relate to others and connect to others in ways that are reciprocal, in ways that, make sense to us. And ultimately, he seems to be where these psychologists are correct is that, yes, he's fragmented. He's got parts of himself that aren't integrated. He has a tremendous amount of, chaos and chasms within him. And you're right. It's not until the trial where he looks at the camera and realizes, I'm too tired to do all this anymore. You see that integration of like real emotions come through.
And by the way, in that moment or just after that moment, in less than an hour, the jury has already come back with a verdict. And not surprisingly, midway through them reading, so far he's guilty of everything. That's when the bomb goes off and he escapes. He escapes into the car of some Joker fanatics, one of them dressed exactly like him. Almost like The Shadow to some degree, where you've got Arthur looking at someone who looks just like him, and yet he seems almost confused or scared of that character.
And he's literally being pulled around by this guy.
Yeah, like here, get in the car. We're gonna drive you around. We're gonna get you out of here. And when the car comes to a stop, Arthur gets out, and we literally see, because as if the symbolism wasn't enough, we literally see him running away from the Joker. We see that he is Arthur, and that even this persona is chasing him and is a burden for him.
Yeah.
And he's scared of it, and he's trying to get away from it.
With the violence and chaos and destruction all around him, he's just looking for safety and comfort and escape. And he runs into Lee.
Yeah. And this is one of those, is
now,
this
was she
scene
there
real
or
or
not?
not? Because he runs to the famous stairs, and she's there. And she explains that this was never going to be more than a fantasy. You knew, you should have known you were never going to get out. We were never going to flee town. We weren't going to go anywhere. This was exactly how it was always meant to play out. And she tells him goodbye and leaves. And in that moment, the police cars start coming up, and I'm not gonna lie, when we suddenly cut to the ground level looking up the staircase, and the police cars are in the foreground, and Arthur's up top on the stairs, shoulders shrugged, sort of slumped down. I was convinced she wasn't going to be in the shot. Like, oh,
okay, yeah.
But we do see her walk away. If I were a cop, I'd be like, hey, where are you going?
Right.
But
it's Gotham.
But we do see her walk away. And so, yeah, but that's another scene where I was just like, it is so questionable as to whether she was even there, whether they had this conversation. Like you, I absolutely believe that she is not pregnant. And he goes back to prison, and then the not so surprising ending is that he has let down his true believers, the people who made him a hero within his own community. He's told he's got a visitor. Who's the visitor? Could it be Harleen come back to be with him? Could it be Catherine Keener coming back to express her desire for him to get better? Could it be...
You got to have the trial again.
Yeah, could it be like any number of the... No. Clearly, this was a moment set up by the guards and by one of the other prisoners who we've been watching, being like, okay, when's this going to happen?
Yeah.
The guy stops him, tries to tell him a joke, and then shivs him several times in the stomach. And as Arthur dies on the floor, we don't really see, because it's blurry in the background, the focus is not on him, but we know that the other person then cut the big smile into his cheeks with the knife, clearly paying homage to the other person who won the Academy Award for playing Joker, and suggesting that the legacy of Joker will continue and that this unnamed prisoner is going to fulfill the destiny that Arthur couldn't, that he is the next in the line, which then gets us to the point where we could be like, oh, the Joker, similar to Ra's al Ghul, never dies, just gets passed on from one person to another. I'm unhappy with that notion simply because it resets the table. Suddenly you go, oh, I actually don't know anything about Joker. Like, I knew something about someone who they were inspired by, but I don't actually know anything about the Joker. They're still an unreliable narrator to me.
That's what the comic books asserted for so long, is you're not supposed to know his
But the problem that I have with that is that not that we don't know anything about the history, but if you're going to tell us the history, lean into it and don't chicken out. If I look at the Joker in the comics, I've never thought he was not genuine. I've never thought he was not exactly the clown prince that he claimed to be. And if we're taking the end of this movie as the origin story for potentially that Joker, then that Joker was never that person. That Joker became that person. And I liked the idea of a man who was driven to this, who thought he was funny, who actually put on the clown makeup, who had a problem, granted it was linked to mental illness and anxiety, but the laugh was haunting. Now I'm just watching someone performative recreate someone that they were disappointed by.
So he's like pantomiming. He's mimicking someone else.
Yeah, and becoming something else. Like, do I think that guy is going to run around with a crazed laugh? I mean, maybe, because he seems a bit on the.
He already kind of seemed that way
on the crazy side.
So you kind of want him to be more authentic. Like, this guy's just copying that guy. He's not.
Exactly. That's what I mean. Okay. Is like, I want him to be authentic. I want him to be himself. I don't want him to be a recreation of something that he saw 2 cells over. But yeah, so basically the hope and dream of a third movie, which I don't think was ever going to happen, because this movie is just so bleak, and so, for as much as we've talked about it, you don't necessarily feel it while you're sitting there watching it. Like, I had to talk myself into what I liked about it earlier today. Last night I was just like, wow, I am mesmerized by how bored I am.
So tell me, I have a couple questions for you as we wrap this up. Did you like this version of Harley, and what was the purpose of having Harley in this second movie? And the second part of that, which is related to, I think in a lot of ways, Lady Gaga playing Harley, is help me understand the mechanism of music in this film.
Cannot do that. I cannot help you understand the mechanism of music. I stopped liking music somewhere in the early 90s.
Well, as in the context of their these performances. Like, I understand. Look, I get it that when Joker and Harley have these fantasies together, these duets, in some scenes they're actually singing to each other. I believe that they are actually singing in the scene, in the actual, like, it's grounded in reality. Mm-hmm. And then there are elements that are more like hyper fantasies where I think they're just,
well, now they're on a variety show stage.
Yeah, they're in a joint fantasy. Yeah. And so what is that for them? Is that the expression of their love? Only then to realize that wasn't real anyway, that both of them had this very superficial relationship to one another. They didn't know one another at all.
Similar to all musicals, the music that they're singing is always subtext, right? Okay. So, and this is why I didn't necessarily like it in here, is because it was a little too on the nose, which jukebox musicals have a tendency to be. A little too on the nose, and a little too much text in your subtext, you know, like if you're sitting down and you're watching a musical and suddenly someone says goodbye to someone and they're really happy and they look up at the window and they see the light turn on, the person who just left them has gotten to their apartment, and they put their hands in their pockets and they just start singing, and they're clearly not singing this out to the world. No one is yelling down at them, "Hey, shut up."
It's a literal scene from My Fair Lady.
It is. They are singing. Thank you for picking that up. They are singing their feelings, their emotions, right? They are. You're understanding their subtext in this way, but when you're watching, you know, Folie à Deux, it's just them singing at each other. And they're not even singing two different sets of emotion. They're just sort of singing together at each other. And I think the closest thing is the fantasy moment where he imagines them on a like the Joker and Harley variety show, and they come out and they're singing together. And this is after he has learned that she has lied to him. Mm-hmm. They are singing together, and then when she turns her back on him, he takes it personally and stops singing. And she's like, "What's wrong?" And he's like, "You're not even looking at me anymore. This is supposed to be about me, how much you love me. This song is supposed to be how much you love me. And it's not about that." And she's like, no, this song's not about how much I love you. We're singing to them, the audience. Right. And he's like, "Oh, is that what it is?" And then she pulls out a gun and shoots him in the gut in his imagination. Yeah. Because to him, learning that she may not love him the way that he thought, you know, like that to me is the most musical moment in the movie. But the rest of the songs are just so on the nose, you know. Zack Snyder could have decided what music was going to go into these individual scenes where you're just like, really? Hallelujah. This is what we're going to play. Like that, like it's that sort of like, can we be a little more subtle?
I liked it.
You might. I mean,
no, the Snyder thing you just mentioned.
Oh, the Snyder thing. Well, he's used that song like 3 times.
Yeah,
so
just
it's
that, just
you know,
that
in
song.
what movie? But yeah, so I don't really know how to answer your question in that regard. Simply to say that more often than not, the music is more about subtext and is more about the feeling of the person singing and is more about, you know, all of that. Unless you're talking about like Hard Knot Life from Annie.
Right.
They're just all passing the time as they're scrubbing the floors for Mrs. Hannigan.
Unlike
or make
Annie.
them laugh in Singing in the Rain. Like that's a very clear, like, by the way, that's my favorite musical of all time. And that's because to me, all the music in that movie makes sense because they are vaudeville actors who are genuine performers who have bits and routines. They've just decided to start doing them. And occasionally Donald O'Connell will just start playing the piano. And you're like,
you know, I don't like that one so much.
You what?
I don't like that one so much.
Well, you're going to watch it again soon because now I've got it in my head.
So are we then to agree that there's a level of subversion here, that the songs and the performances in themselves sometimes take on the violence, the lies, the manipulation, the aspects that have come up for him, at least, I don't know about her so much, but have come up for him around his relationship to her. Like, isn't this about us? And she's like, no, this is about us performing for other people. For
each other and for others.
Yeah, like the whole point of this is a show.
Down to the final scene where she starts singing and he keeps begging her to stop singing. Like, can't we just talk for a second?
I actually liked that.
Sure.
But I thought that was a way, I also thought that was subversive, not too deep, but in a way to say, like, we've been doing the singing and that has been the romantic way in which we've expressed our shared love and how no one understands us. And remember back with the Harley Quinn show when I said, when people are in abusive relationships and they say no one understands us, that's kind of a red flag. That he at one point wants to stop that and genuinely connect to her, and she doesn't want that. That's not what this was about for her. No, that's probably too that feels unsafe to her.
But
She
I also
needs
feel
all of this like vaudeville stuff to fog around her so that she's not genuinely caring for somebody.
And you brought up, like, your first question was about her.
Yes.
And I think that that's really where we're landing, is that I never, if you just want to treat her as the shadow side, fine. But notice how we've not spoken about her much at all throughout this podcast, because she doesn't give us anything. Like, everything that we know about her is a lie. We don't really know what's going on outside of the scenes we see her in. And she abandons us the way that she abandons Arthur. So there's nothing to say about her except that she may not even be there. We don't know. We have no idea.
Yeah.
And so
she doesn't feel like a full person. She just feels like parts.
Yeah.
I did want to ask you, now in the origin story of Harley Quinn in the comics, there's a one-shot written by Dini and Tim that portrays Harley being a psychologist at Arkham who falls in love with the Joker, who's a patient. And where, in my interpretation of that story, it's the Joker who's manipulative and shows certain sides of himself for her to kind of fall in love with him.
That's what I was going to say about her.
Do you think it's a role reversal?
Yes.
Is what my question was.
She
this
is
feels
the abuser.
like the opposite.
She is the abuser in this relationship.
Got it. Okay. I felt the same way.
And I didn't know how to feel about that, if I can be honest.
Okay.
And it's sort of why I haven't brought it up. She is absolutely the manipulator. She is absolutely the abuser. Am I happy with making Harley Quinn the abuser after so many years of her having been the abused? I don't know. Like, I could take it or leave it. You know, if you want to say that the character is getting her comeuppance, I wouldn't say that this is the way to do it. It would have been in a show like Harley Quinn, where she genuinely comes into her own. She leans so heavily on Joker in this particular movie, but not in the same way. He is in no way abusive toward her, which is good. But at the same time, it does leave a bad taste in your mouth when you realize just how manipulative and how much of the shadow self she is.
I agree with that. I wasn't really enjoying this version of Harley.
Yeah.
And I don't know that I've ever felt like any live action depiction. Margot Robbie is probably a better depiction of who I think Harley Quinn is. Ultimately,
Not Mia Sara from the Birds of Prey TV series.
what I was going to mention.
Can't believe I just pulled that out of my head.
What I was going to mention is if there were ever to be a depiction that I think might appeal to me, it might be in the Penguin. If she exists in that show, because so far I've really appreciated the fullness of all those characters.
Yeah.
She could be written correctly. Correctly sounds very blaming, but
that's also one of those shows where, everyone was asking, why is he not Oswald Cobblepot? Why is he Oz Cobb?
Who cares? What?
Well, the explanation was given by the, Matt Reeves, and he was saying that, Edward Nygma isn't Edward Nygma in the Batman, it's Edward Nash. And in the comics, they've started to change the names of some of these characters so that they're not so cartoonish and obvious.
Sure.
Like, really, Enigma? Like, that's your God-given name.
But Oswald Cobblepot sounds like a normal name to me.
No, totally. But they were trying to make it less cartoonish. And they were like, well, we've never gotten around to changing Oswald's name.
Got it.
And so he went to Jim Lee and was like, do you think it's okay if we change it to Oz Cobb? And Jim's like, yeah, go for it. Like, Jim seems like such a, yeah, go. Get it.
Do it.
Do what you need.
Just do it.
Make this your world. And I appreciate that. I appreciate that about Jim and DC is like, they're not so married to tradition that you have to be Oswald Cobblepot. You have to be Edward Nygma.
Right.
You could bring, like I wondered, is she called Lee in this movie because you didn't want to call her Harley Quinn? But then they come right out and said, "Oh, her name is Harleen Quinzel." And,
no, they say her name is Harley Quinn.
No. And
is it Quinzel?
When they're showing up, when they're showing the newspaper of her, they say Harleen Quinzel. And so I was like, oh no, you just went ahead and stayed with the Harley Quinn.
Name. The last little treat we get, a little Easter egg. I don't know if it's an Easter egg, but there are very subtle, maybe not so subtle, but there's a couple of shots after the explosion in the courtroom that shows Harvey Dent with a burnt up face.
Scratched up. He's not really burnt up.
He's
got scratches. There's like bloody scratches, but he's not like, he's not,
It's not like acid was thrown on his face.
At no point in time is he Tommy Lee Jones or Aaron Eckhart or,
But I liked it. I giggled.
It was fine.
I didn't hate it. Those are the kinds of things that I look for.
Yeah. I mean, at least we never saw him take out a coin, so we got that going for us.
I wouldn't have hated that either. I'm a sucker for these things.
I know you are.
Okay. So, what did I rate this film in terms of psychological science? I gave it a 7 out of 10, actually, because again,
smart.
When we think about science and media, for science consultants, we don't say it necessarily has to be accurate. It has to be believable. And I thought they did a great job with that, right? So 7 out of 10. As a movie, like in general, as an entertaining movie, 5 out of 10. I don't have an interest in seeing this again because as you mentioned, it's just so bleak. Yeah. And it's not as if the musical numbers are so catchy. I want to buy the soundtrack and hear them again.
Yeah.
No.
Like we saw the first one in theaters twice. I cannot imagine going back to see this one again. And I don't even know that I would necessarily own it or even turn it on when it hits max. Like, do I need to watch this movie again?
I wouldn't find myself.
Not really. No.
As a DC movie, 6 out of 10. If we're using a different scale for DC
what's the scale for that?
Just like living in the DC universe.
What's the 1 on a DC movie and what's a 10 on the DC movie?
Like what are examples?
Yeah, like if you were saying it's a different scale because it's of the DC movies, it's a 6 out of 10. What falls at the very bottom of that scale and what falls at the very top of the scale?
If I include animated movies, maybe some of the less interesting animated movies at the bottom, but at the top, you're gonna hate me. You're gonna hate me so much. The
Batman and Robin.
Batman Returns and the Batman, Matt Reeves, the Batman would be like 8s and 9s. The Nolan films would be like solid 7s and 8s.
So you don't have a 10. You don't have like an actual like what's at the height of that scale.
It's in the future.
Oh, okay. You're saving it for some Penguin the movie coming out.
My philosophy about the 10 is that if you give a 10, then you can't give something better than a 10. And you may encounter something that's better than the thing you gave a 10.
My philosophy is the numbers don't have to stay constant.
Oh, you can
is that I could put something at a 10. So for instance, if I go to a concert and it is the worst experience of my life, but it's the very first concert I've ever been to, it's still the best concert I've ever been to.
Okay, so you just change the anchors? That just sounds sloppy.
Yes.
Like that's messy. I don't like it.
Right. It becomes, okay, so then if I go to see a concert that I loved, I would then say, okay, that one's now the best concert I've ever been to, and the other one has moved down. And the more concerts I go to, the more that one hits the number one, it gets pushed down to the bottom. So putting it at a 10 spot doesn't mean it's at a solid 10. It simply means it's the best one so far. And it can move down and up based on what comes out later.
So what would you rate this movie in the movie universe, like of all movies.
Of all movies?
Yeah.
Just on an emotional hedge, I would say like 6. Maybe.
Oh, okay.
Like,
that's not too different than my 5.
Well, no, only because I'm fairly neutral to this movie. While I was sitting there, I was like, there are things I like about it. There are things I don't like. I wouldn't say that there's anything I hated about it. I just didn't care about it. So if I would say like, emotionally, if I'm at a number 5, it's because I really didn't feel one way or another about it.
Can I just say the acting performances, the folks in this movie are great.
Great.
Clearly, Joaquin Phoenix embodies Arthur Fleck.
Great.
He's mesmerizing. He's sympathetic. He's interesting. Like, he truly did a fantastic job.
Yep.
Lady Gaga is fine. I think she obviously she's truly talented. I forgot his name. The main guard that we're kind of
Brendan
following.
Gleeson. The father of your beloved.
How can I forget him? He's really great. Like this is not a terrible movie.
No, the performances are fantastic. I would even say the script is good.
Yeah.
I just think the pacing, it feels slow. And again, this is probably Todd Phillips being like, yeah, but I want it to feel like it's a movie from the late 70s, early 80s. Like I want it to have that pacing. But I don't need Dog Day Afternoon to take place in a courtroom. Like the Joker is not interesting to me if he is confined to a single location. Like it's just not. It's not interesting.
Yeah. And I think I said this about the first movie. Ultimately, you feel very confined with him. This is a movie that puts you super up close in proximity, in intimacy with Joker.
Yes.
And it is uncomfortable and it makes you feel weird and you're not sure, do I feel bad for him? Do I feel sorry for him? Do I like him? Do I hate him? I think it does. And I think it's meant to give you that job. You're kind of confined and trapped with this homicidal guy who you're just trying to figure out, and you're locked in with him. That, I think those are the feelings that you have. And that's why I'm saying, even as a psychologist who assesses people, this is not a feeling that I want to have again. I'm not ready to press play on this movie anytime soon.
Yeah.
By the way, the neurological disorder that Arthur has, that spontaneous laughing that he can't seem to control, is known as pseudobulbar affect. And it's when somebody has inappropriate emotional expressions, sometimes crying, sometimes laughing. The umbrella,
like laughing at a funeral.
Yeah. The umbrella disorder is involuntary emotional expression disorder. Sometimes it's called pathological laughing. And we see in instances where he's really amped up emotionally and the only thing he can do is laugh. So that's a miswiring. There's also scenes where he forces his laughter.
Yes. There's much more, or I should say there's much less genuine laughter in this movie than there was in the first one.
Yeah. He's sort of trying to force a sensation that is positive and lively.
Yeah.
And that's really hard to watch. But that also happens with people as well. It can be a side effect of medication where you can't feel the kinds of things that you used to feel intensely. And so you try to force it. Or
like when you go to the
emulate
dentist and suddenly you can't feel the things that you used to feel.
Can I just say, we've been
intensely.
talking so long that the anesthetic numbing has
worn off.
So do you want to start again?
Yeah, let's go ahead. Let's go ahead and have this conversation again. Drea, why don't you tell the good folks where they can find you online?
I want to tell the good folks that I have to make a correction from our previous episode.
All right.
A very minor correction when we were talking about Harley and the Joker and some research demonstrating the likelihood of intimate partner violence. I mentioned that sometimes the level of education can intimidate partners and increase the likelihood of violence. And I think I expressed it that way. Let me just clarify. There's a nuance here. There's mitigating factors here. In general, when women have more education, that's a protective factor. So it doesn't mean that the more education you have, the more likely it is you'll encounter intimate partner violence. I did not want to, say, I didn't want to misinterpret or
Sure.
Describe that wrong.
Yeah.
It's that when partners have a discrepancy between them, and it's the male partner who has less education and ostensibly less income, less power, that discrepancy, the bigger it is, that discrepancy, that's the factor that increases the likelihood of intimate partner violence.
Got it.
Does that make sense? So it's the gap in income. It's not the idea. It's not the constant. It's not the single factor of the female partner making more money and having more education. Thanks for letting me have a chance to
set the record straight.
Set that straight. With that, you can find me, if you're still listening, you can find me online, drdreapsychology.com. You can find my article on the Joker from the 2019 film. It describes all of these different mental illnesses and deficits and characterizations, which you might be interested in. My Instagram is Dr. Drea Psychology, and our voicemail is on drdreapsychology.com if you want to leave us a voice note.
Excellent. You can find me online. I am on Instagram at B_Ward028. You can find us both on Instagram at the Arkham Sessions. Email us at arkhamsessions@gmail.com. Find us on Facebook. Follow us on Threads, all the places. You can also follow our good friends over at Fanbase Press. Congratulations to them. They just had a Kickstarter that just funded, and they will be doing hardcover copies of their book Ripple Effects. They will also donate, I believe it was 20 copies to local schools and libraries as well. They reached that funding level of their goal. So congratulations to all involved in that. Fantastic work. Go follow them at Fanbase Press, or go to fanbasepress.com to check out their other comic books, their news, their podcasts. They're good people. We highly recommend them. And there are other people I highly recommend, and those are the folks who have joined Patreon and have join the $5 tier or higher, so that they can be called out in shows just like this one. We'll start with Trevor Schwartz, Aaron Wenrick, Mike Ficklin, Lindsay B., Dr. Jerome Anderson, Antonio Lopez, Kevin Ortel, Todd Stashwick, Hero's Journey Fitness, Mark Pepper, Frank Moeller, Swara Salih, Jamaric YJ, SK, and my father, Carl Ward. Thank you all for joining patreon.com/Arkham Sessions. And you can get your name called out by joining the $5 tier, or you can decide what we cover next after Harley Quinn by joining the $3 tier. There are lots of tiers. Join them. The only one I don't recommend necessarily at this moment is the one for the challenge coin, because we have completely sold out. And we're working on maybe trying to decide if there's one coming up in the future. If you got ideas, let us know. Until next time, I am Brian Ward.
I'm Dr. Drea Letamendi.
And together we are
the Arkham Sessions.